The night is quiet, the world asleep. So pour yourself some coffee, settle in, and let the mystery begin. You're watching Sherlock Tales. Subscribe now and step deeper into the shadows with every story. The fog that clung to London's streets on that grey February morning of 1891 seemed to whisper of mysteries yet to unfold. From the window of our lodgings at 221B Baker Street, the familiar thoroughfare appeared as a ghostly tableau, with hansom cabs emerging and disappearing like phantoms in the swirling mist. I found my friend Sherlock Holmes standing motionless at that very window, his sharp profile etched against the pale light, lost in one of those profound meditations that often preceded his most brilliant deductions. The sitting room bore the familiar signs of Holmes's restless intellect. His violin lay abandoned upon the settee, sheet music scattered across the Persian carpet, and the acrid smell of his latest chemical experiment lingered in the air. Mrs. Hudson's gentle reproaches from below provided a domestic counterpoint to the morning's mysterious atmosphere. It was precisely at 9:30 when our tranquil morning was shattered by the urgent clatter of footsteps upon our stairs, followed by Inspector Lestrade's familiar, if somewhat breathless, voice calling out to Mrs. Hudson. The door burst open to admit the wiry figure of Scotland Yard's most persistent, if not always most perceptive, representative. "Mr. Holmes!" Lestrade exclaimed, his sharp features flushed with exertion and no small measure of frustration. "Thank heavens I find you in. We have a case at Vauxhall that would confound Solomon himself, and the Commissioner is demanding answers I simply cannot provide." Holmes turned from the window with that peculiar smile that always indicated his interest had been piqued. "Ah, Lestrade. Your dramatic entrance suggests either a promotion or a predicament of unusual complexity. Pray, take the chair by the fire. Watson, perhaps you would oblige our visitor with some brandy. I perceive he has spent a sleepless night wrestling with impossibilities." As I attended to this courtesy, I observed Lestrade with the practiced eye that years of chronicling Holmes's cases had developed. The inspector's usually immaculate appearance showed signs of considerable strain. His collar was slightly askew, his boots bore traces of sawdust, and there was a faint odor of carbolic soap about his person, suggesting he had spent considerable time in a theatre or music hall. "You're quite right, Mr. Holmes," Lestrade said, accepting the brandy gratefully. "I've been at the Vauxhall Pavilion since the small hours, and I confess myself completely baffled. We have a disappearance that defies every principle of rational investigation." Holmes settled into his armchair, his grey eyes now bright with anticipation. "A disappearance, you say? From Vauxhall? Pray continue, Inspector. The details, if you please." Lestrade drew forth his notebook with the air of a man presenting evidence he scarcely believed himself. "The facts are these, Mr. Holmes. Last evening, the Vauxhall Pavilion hosted a special Valentine's concert featuring Mr. Ambrose Hollis, the celebrated violinist. You may have read of him in the papers. They call him the Prince of his instrument." "I am familiar with his reputation," Holmes replied. "A virtuoso of considerable skill, if the critics are to be believed." Continue. "The concert was a triumph by all accounts. Mr. Hollis performed the first half to thunderous applause, then retired to his dressing room during the interval at 9:30. His dresser, a reliable fellow named Pike, attended him with the customary refreshments and left him at 9:40 by the pavilion clock. At 9:50, the call boy knocked to summon him for the second half. No response. Holmes leaned forward slightly. "The door?" "Locked from the inside, Mr. Holmes. Bolted fast." The manager, Mr. Julius Mortlake, tried his master key, but the bolt prevented entry. They raised the alarm immediately. A constable was posted beneath the single window, which overlooks a narrow service yard, and the stage door keeper, one Bingham, maintained his watch at the only other exit from that section of the building. I found myself drawn into the narrative despite its seemingly impossible nature. "And when you gained entry?" "That's just it, Doctor. When we finally forced the door, the room was empty, completely empty. Mr. Hollis had vanished as surely as if he had dissolved into the very air. Holmes's fingers drummed silently against the arm of his chair. "You speak of vanishing, Lestrade, but men do not simply evaporate. What remained in the room?" His evening coat hung upon its peg, his hat rested on the chair, and his violin case lay open upon the table, but empty. The Stradivarius itself was gone. There was a pinch of rosin powder on the table, a damp towel at the washstand, and Lestrade paused, consulting his notes. A curious detail. The violin bow was found beneath the table, its horsehair cut clean through as if by a sharp knife. "Most interesting," Holmes murmured. "To cut the bow hair suggests both haste and deliberate intent. What else?" A thread of blue silk caught upon the window latch. Cheap material by the look of it. A faint smudge of lampblack on the interior sill, and Pike mentioned an odd smell. Carbolic, he thought, though he couldn't be certain. Holmes rose and began his characteristic pacing. "The window, you examined it thoroughly." "From every angle, Mr. Holmes. Latched from within, no tool marks, putty intact. The constable below swears on his mother's grave that nothing passed that window, not so much as a cat. The drop to the yard is 30 feet with no drain pipes or footholds. The gate to the lane was bolted and tested by Bingham himself at 9:30. "And yet," Holmes observed, "a man and a priceless violin have somehow departed a locked room under the observation of 3 witnesses. Tell me, Lestrade, what manner of man is this Ambrose Hollis? By all accounts, a gentleman of artistic temperament but sound character. 30 years of age, with perhaps a touch of Italian blood in his features. He's risen quickly in the past 3 years. The ladies are quite devoted to him, and his performances command the highest fees. He lodges in Fitzrovia, banks in the Strand, and while some whisper of debts, others claim he's as careful with money as any banker." Holmes paused in his pacing, his keen gaze fixed upon some invisible point in the middle distance. "You mentioned Mr. Mortlake, the manager. What sort of man?" "A showman of the old school, loud waistcoats and a louder voice. But his reputation is sound enough. The pavilion has been respectable under his management, and he seemed as genuinely distressed by the disappearance as anyone. If he could have conjured Mr. Hollis back by magic, I believe he would have sold his soul to do it." "And the violin itself? This Stradivarius?" "A Cremona of 1713, they tell me. Worth 3,000 guineas if it's worth a penny. They call it the Seraph for its silvery tone. There are men in Paris and Vienna who would risk the gallows for such an instrument." Holmes returned to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. When he turned again, I recognized the expression that invariably preceded his acceptance of a challenging case. "Lestrade, you have presented us with a most stimulating problem. A man enters a room with one exit under observation and subsequently vanishes along with a priceless instrument, leaving behind only a severed bow and a thread of silk. The miraculous nature of this disappearance suggests human agency of considerable ingenuity." Lestrade sprang to his feet, relief evident in his features. "Then you'll take the case, Mr. Holmes?" "Indeed I shall. Watson, your coat and hat. We have an appointment with impossibility. There is an economy of marvels in this world, Inspector, and when the supernatural intrudes upon the merely curious, there is usually a very human hand behind the curtain." As we prepared to depart for Vauxhall, Holmes paused at the door, his grey eyes bright with the thrill of intellectual combat. "Come, gentlemen. Let us discover whether Mr. Ambrose Hollis has truly learned to fly, or merely to walk where other men do not think to look." The fog seemed to part before us as we descended into the street, as if London itself were clearing the way for the investigation that would test even Sherlock Holmes's remarkable powers of deduction. Behind us, the comfortable familiarity of Baker Street. Ahead, the gaslit mysteries of Vauxhall and a puzzle that promised to challenge every assumption about the possible and the impossible. The journey to Vauxhall proved both swift and instructive. our hansom cutting through the thinning fog with the precision Holmes had predicted from our driver's military bearing. My friend maintained his characteristic silence, broken only once to observe that the fog was lifting from the south, a detail that seemed inconsequential until I recalled his habit of cataloguing every circumstance that might bear upon a mystery. The Vauxhall pavilion emerged from the grey morning like a theatrical set-piece, its ornate facade gleaming wet in the strengthening light. Despite the early hour, a small crowd of sensation-seekers had gathered, their whispered speculations creating a buzz of excitement that followed us as Lestrade led us around to the stage entrance. The air here carried that peculiar mixture of damp masonry, stale tobacco, and grease paint that clings to all places of public entertainment. "The service yard lies just here," Lestrade explained, guiding us into a narrow, cobbled space bounded by high brick walls. Above us, some 30 feet up the sheer facade, a single grimy window stared down like an unblinking eye. A sturdy constable stood at attention below, his breath pluming in the chill air. "Constable Davies," Lestrade introduced. 20 years on the force, he maintained watch from 9:45 until we forced the door. Holmes immediately knelt to examine the ground beneath the window, his movements precise and methodical. I watched him scrutinize what appeared to be ordinary dust and debris, then trace his fingers along the building's foundation, where the brickwork showed a curious discoloration. "Interesting," he murmured, withdrawing his magnifying glass. "The absence of disturbance is often more telling than its presence. No rope marks, no scratches from climbing apparatus. Yet—" He paused, studying something that had caught his attention before rising and surveying the iron gate that provided the yard's only other exit. "Now then," he declared, "let us examine the scene itself." The interior corridors of the pavilion possessed that hollow, expectant atmosphere common to all theatres during daylight hours. Mr. Julius Mortlake awaited us outside the dressing room, a portly gentleman whose wine-coloured waistcoat could not entirely conceal his obvious distress. "Mr. Holmes, if ever a miracle were needed." "Miracles belong upon the stage, Mr. Mortlake," Holmes replied with a wintry smile. "I deal only in causes." The dressing room itself was modest but comfortable, containing the usual appointments of a performer's space. Holmes's glance took in the splintered door frame, the single gas jet hissing over a spotted mirror, and the violin case lying open upon the table, its red velvet lining bearing the perfect impression of the missing Stradivarius. He knelt beside the table and lifted the severed bow with delicate precision. "Cut cleanly," he observed, "with a honed blade, not serrated. Note the precision, Watson. This suggests both haste and deliberate intent." At the window, he paused longer, testing the latch and examining the frame minutely. The thread of blue silk still clung to the metal end. I observed him carefully detach it with tweezers. "Cheap material," he noted, "frayed near the knot. See how it's pinched where it passed beneath the latch tongue?" He tapped the interior sill. "And here, lamp-black. Stage soot, not chimney grit. Someone with blackened hands handled this sill." "Pike!" Mortlake called, and the dresser appeared. A nervous, clean-shaven fellow who repeated his account without embellishment. When he mentioned that Mr. Hollis had complained of a draught and requested the window be latched firmly, I noticed a peculiar expression cross Holmes's features. "Most illuminating," Holmes murmured, his grey eyes bright with the first glimmerings of understanding. Holmes's examination of the physical evidence proceeded with that methodical precision which had made his reputation throughout London. He returned to the window, not merely observing this time, but demonstrating a theory that had clearly formed in his keen mind. "Pike," he said, withdrawing the blue silk thread from his pocket, "you mentioned that Mr. Hollis was particular about the window being latched firmly. Watch carefully." He arranged the thread beneath the latch mechanism, then opened the window and allowed it to fall closed while maintaining tension on the silk. With a gentle tug from outside, the latch rotated into the locked position, the thread pinching and fraying exactly as the original had shown. "Ingenious," I breathed, but surely impossible with a man watching below. Indeed, Watson. Yet the contrivance tells us something of our quarry's mind, a desire to create the illusion of an inviolate chamber. Holmes pocketed the thread again, but let us continue with our witnesses. The call boy, Ted Varley, proved a pale, earnest lad whose testimony carried the ring of absolute truth. I knocked proper like at 9:50, sir. He repeated to Holmes's questioning. Always answered before, did Mr. Hollis, even if he were tuning. But this time, nothing, though I did hear something scrape like furniture being moved. Any voice? Any indication of distress? No, sir. Just that one sound, then silence. Holmes nodded thoughtfully, then turned his attention to Pike once more. Now then, Pike, I require absolute precision. When you left Mr. Hollis at 9:40, describe his exact state of dress. The dresser shifted uncomfortably. Well, sir, that's what struck me as odd, thinking back. He'd begun changing into his second-half costume, the black velvet jacket with silver buttons, very romantic-like for the closing pieces. But he was only half-dressed when I left, sir. Said he needed a moment to compose himself. Half-dressed, Holmes repeated. Yet you left him with 20 minutes until curtain. Was this usual? Not at all, Mr. Holmes. Mr. Hollis was always punctual, always ready with time to spare, and particular nervous he seemed. Kept rubbing his hands with that towel, though they looked clean enough to me. Holmes lifted the damp towel again, inhaling deeply. Carbolic soap, as we established. But carbolic suggests either medical necessity or the masking of some stronger odor. You're certain this came from your cleaning of the basin? Certain sure, sir. Though now you mention it, Mr. Hollis did wash his hands most thorough after I'd cleaned up. Moving to the evening coat hanging on its peg, Holmes conducted a systematic search of the pockets. His expression grew increasingly thoughtful as he withdrew a silver cigarette case, the evening's program, and finally a small leather notebook bound with elastic. With your permission, Mr. Mortlake, Holmes said, though his tone brooked no refusal. The notebook's pages revealed a mixture of musical notations and cryptic appointments. VR, Tuesday, 3:30. MS, Thursday evening, usual place. And, most intriguingly, payment overdue. Must resolve before Edinburgh engagement. Edinburgh? I inquired. Mortlake nodded gravely. A prestigious engagement at the Assembly Rooms next week would have secured Mr. Hollis's reputation throughout Scotland, and commanded fees to match. Holmes pocketed the notebook. Tell me, who else had access to this corridor during the critical period? Beyond the usual staff, Mortlake considered. There was a gentleman caller earlier, claimed to be from the Musical Times, wanted to arrange an interview. I directed him to the green room, but... He shrugged helplessly. Describe this gentleman. Middle-aged, well-dressed, carried a leather satchel, spoke with authority about musical matters. I assumed he was legitimate. Holmes exchanged a significant glance with me. We shall want to speak with Mr. Otto Vass, your conductor, and I believe you mentioned a Miss Beaumont. Miss Cora Beaumont, yes. She performed a duet in the second half, arrived rather late, in blue silk with matching ribbons. Bingham can confirm the timing. At the stage door, Bingham repeated his account with military precision. Miss Beaumont arrived at 9:35 by cab, sir. Blue silk dress, as you say. Mr. Vass went out to the telegraph office just before interval and returned with time to spare. No one else passed either direction. Holmes's attention sharpened. Mr. Vass went out? For how long? Perhaps 10 minutes, sir. Said he needed to wire his copyist about new parts. We found the conductor in the orchestra room below, a spare man with an anxious academic manner. When Holmes requested to see his hands, faint black smudges lingered at the cuticles despite obvious recent washing. Ruling ink, Vass explained quickly. For the musical scores, I'm quite meticulous about my notations. Indeed, Holmes murmured. And your telegraph errand? Purely professional. My copyist in Bloomsbury requires advance notice for complex arrangements. As Vass departed, Holmes returned once more to the dressing room, his grey eyes bright with the peculiar intensity that marked his moments of greatest concentration. He examined the bolt mechanism with his magnifying glass, then withdrew his finger with a white smear. "French chalk, Watson. Recently applied to ensure smooth operation. Note how the bolt slides with unusual ease for such a robust mechanism." He gestured to the splintered door frame. "Rather excessive security for a dressing room, wouldn't you say? This bolt was designed to keep someone in, or something out." The pieces of the puzzle were accumulating with bewildering complexity. The theatrical timing, the costume change, the mysterious journalist, the conductor's errand, the chalked bolt, and through it all, the impossible vanishing of a man and his priceless violin. Yet I sensed that Holmes was beginning to perceive a pattern in the chaos, a method in what appeared to be madness. "Come, Watson," he said finally. "We must examine the rest of this establishment. When dealing with theatrical impossibilities, one must think like a theatrical mind. Our vanishing violinist has staged a performance, but every performance leaves traces for those who know where to look." Our exploration of the pavilion's hidden spaces began in earnest as Holmes led us down a narrow staircase to the basement level, where the building's true architectural complexity revealed itself. Here, beneath the glamour of the stage, lay a warren of storage rooms, workshops, and mechanical spaces that few patrons ever suspected existed. "Every theatre is built upon deception, Watson," Holmes observed as we navigated the dimly lit corridors. "What the audience sees is merely the surface. Beneath lies the machinery that creates wonder." He paused before a heavy door marked "Scenery Storage," testing the handle with interest. "Recently used," he noted, examining the oil on the hinges and the absence of dust on the threshold. His lockpicks made short work of the mechanism, revealing a cavernous space filled with painted flats, property furniture, and the accumulated artifacts of countless productions. Holmes's attention was immediately drawn to a section of the wooden floor where dust patterns showed recent disturbance. "Heavy objects moved here within the past day," he murmured, tracing the swept arcs with his finger. "Rotation rather than simple displacement, suggesting something wheeled." Moving deeper into the storage area, we discovered a collection of stage properties that would have delighted any student of theatrical artifice. But it was a large wardrobe trunk, its brass fittings gleaming despite the general gloom, that commanded Holmes's complete attention. The shipping label read, "M. Beaumont, C.O. Vauxhall Pavilion." "Watson?" he said quietly, lifting the lid to reveal an interior lined with blue silk. "Observe these indentations in the padding. Something heavy and angular was transported in this trunk. Something approximately the size and shape of a violin case." He withdrew his magnifying glass, examining the lining closely. "The silk matches our window thread perfectly." Returning to the main level, we sought out Miss Cora Beaumont in the green room. She proved to be a striking woman in her late 20s, possessed of the poise that marked her as a seasoned performer. Her blue silk dress was indeed of the cheaper material Holmes had identified, though she wore it with considerable elegance. "Mr. Holmes," she said, rising gracefully as we entered. "Such a terrible mystery. One moment Ambrose was there, the next—" She gestured helplessly, her dark eyes reflecting apparent distress. "You knew Mr. Hollis well?" Holmes inquired, studying her with that penetrating gaze. "Professionally only. We rehearsed perhaps half a dozen times over the past fortnight. He was demanding but brilliant, the sort of musician who elevates everyone around him." She paused, a slight flush coloring her cheeks, though he did seem troubled lately. He mentioned financial pressures, debts that needed settling before his Edinburgh engagement. There was also talk of a collector, someone pursuing him for the Seraph. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "A collector, you say?" "A Mr. Vernon Rook, I believe. Ambrose met with him on Tuesday. He seemed quite agitated afterward. Mentioned something about a potential sale if circumstances forced his hand. As we prepared to leave, Mortlake appeared with additional information. "There was another gentleman caller yesterday," he said nervously. "A music critic from the Liar's Voice, Mr. Augustus Cavendish. Quite insistent about speaking with Mr. Hollis regarding a critical review." Holmes accepted the business card Mortlake produced, examining it briefly before pocketing it without comment. "Most illuminating," he murmured. We found Otto Vass in the orchestra room, and Holmes's request to examine his hands revealed faint black smudges at the cuticles, despite obvious recent washing. More intriguingly, tiny abrasions marked the fingertips. "Pumice residue," Holmes observed quietly to me. "Used to smooth rough surfaces or to ensure frictionless movement of mechanical parts." "Ruling ink and engraving work," Vass explained hastily. "I'm quite meticulous about my musical notations." As we departed, Holmes's expression had taken on that particular intensity, indicating his mind was racing ahead of the available evidence. "Watson," he said quietly, "we have discovered the stage machinery, trunk, hamper, collector, critic, but the performance itself remains hidden. Our vanishing violinist has staged something far more complex than a simple disappearance." The pieces were accumulating with bewildering rapidity. The prepared trunk, the mysterious collector, the insistent critic, the conductor's suspicious activities, and through it all, the impossible locked room that defied every principle of rational investigation. Our continued exploration of the pavilion's architectural mysteries began with Holmes's systematic examination of the corridor walls, his knuckles tapping methodically along the plaster as he searched for the subtle variations in tone that might reveal hidden spaces. Mortlake, eager to assist, provided a hastily sketched floor plan that Holmes studied with characteristic intensity. "The mathematics of deception, Watson," he murmured, measuring distances with his pacing. "Every theatre is built upon the principle that what appears solid may conceal the most ingenious mechanisms." His tapping ceased abruptly, at a point adjacent to Hollis's dressing room. Here, the sound is distinctly hollow. At Holmes's request, Mortlake produced the key to the adjoining musician's retiring room, a seldom-used space containing only 2 bentwood chairs and a cracked mirror. Holmes immediately approached the shared wall, his keen eyes examining the junction where skirting met plaster. "Observe, Watson, here the paint stands proud and unchipped, while there," he indicated a section 2 feet to the left, "the grain shows through an over-hasty brush." His penknife appeared with practiced ease, and with delicate pressure at the skirting's edge, he caused a narrow board to spring outward by perhaps an inch. Behind it yawned a black opening, no larger than a letter slot. "Ingenious," I breathed, as Holmes held his lamp close to the aperture. A faint grey smear adhered to the edge, and when he withdrew his finger, it bore traces of both lampblack and French chalk. "Applied to ensure silent operation," he observed. "A very pretty contrivance indeed. Note how the chalk facilitates smooth movement, while the lampblack serves to blacken any hands that might operate this mechanism." Lestrade whistled in amazement. A secret panel. Then our vanishing violinist was spirited away beneath our very noses. Holmes replaced the board with a gentle click, but I noticed he did not commit himself to Lestrade's obvious conclusion. Instead, he knelt to examine the corridor floor with scrupulous care, eventually extracting with his tweezers a single curl of pale wood such as a carpenter's plane might produce. "Recent work," he noted, slipping the shaving into his pocket. "But by whom and for what purpose?" We summoned Hargreaves, the head carpenter, a lean, square-shouldered man whose honest demeanor immediately impressed me. His testimony proved illuminating. He had indeed performed maintenance work the previous afternoon, adjusting hinges and planing a swollen door, though he insisted he had touched neither skirting nor plaster in the corridor. "However," he added thoughtfully, "I did lend my handcart around 6 o'clock to help move a hamper from scenery storage. Blue ribbon on the handle, I recall, on account of it catching a splinter." Holmes's interest sharpened. perceptibly. "Who requested the cart?" "Pike, I believe, or perhaps young Ted. I was up a ladder and paid it no particular mind at the time." Our subsequent questioning of Pike revealed the curious chain of events. Miss Beaumont's trunk had been relocated from the corridor to scenery storage, and in its place, Pike had transported a large wicker hamper with blue ribbon trim, ostensibly for refreshments, though its size seemed excessive for such purposes. As these revelations accumulated, I began to perceive the outline of a solution. The secret panel provided the means, the hamper offered concealment, and Miss Beaumont's presence connected all the blue silk evidence. Yet when I glanced at Holmes, I was surprised to find his expression troubled rather than triumphant. "The pieces fit together with remarkable precision, Watson," he said quietly as we prepared to depart the pavilion. "Perhaps too remarkable. In my experience, genuine crimes are rarely so accommodating to the investigator's logic." Before leaving, Holmes insisted on one final experiment. He had the interval bell rung and timed the passage from Hollis's dressing room to various points throughout the building, listening carefully as I dragged furniture across the floor of the adjoining room. "The scrape would carry distinctly," he observed. "Every sound, every movement would be audible to a careful listener." As we emerged into the grey afternoon, Holmes paused beneath a gas lamp, his grey eyes reflecting that peculiar intensity that marked his moments of greatest concentration. "We have been presented with a most elaborate theatrical performance. Watson, the question that remains is whether we are intended to be the audience, or merely the critics who validate the illusion." The investigation had revealed a mechanically perfect solution. Secret panel, convenient hamper, suspicious timing, and abundant physical evidence all pointing toward Miss Beaumont. Yet Holmes's growing skepticism suggested that this very perfection might itself be the greatest deception of all. We were dealing not merely with a vanishing violinist, but with someone who understood that the most convincing lie is often the one that appears to reveal itself through careful investigation. "Come," Holmes said finally, "we must examine this apparent solution from every angle before we accept its convenient truth. In matters of theatrical impossibility, Watson, the most obvious explanation is frequently the most elaborate misdirection." The journey to Fitzrovia proved both swift and illuminating, our hansom cutting through the afternoon traffic as Holmes maintained that contemplative silence which invariably preceded his most penetrating insights. I observed him studying Hollis's leather notebook with renewed attention, his grey eyes reflecting the peculiar intensity that marked his wrestling with contradictory evidence. "Watson," he said suddenly, as we approached Newman Street, "consider this troubling paradox. We have discovered what appears to be a perfect mechanism for an impossible crime. Secret panel, convenient transportation, suspicious timing. Yet in my experience, genuine criminals rarely provide such accommodating evidence. Real malefactors make mistakes, leave loose ends, act from passion rather than calculated precision." The observation struck me as particularly astute, given the almost theatrical perfection of the clues we had uncovered. Every piece of evidence seemed to point with mathematical certainty toward Miss Beaumont's complicity, yet this very certainty was beginning to trouble my friend's analytical mind. Hollis's lodgings occupied the first floor of a respectable house in Newman Street, where we were received by Mrs. Larkin, a neat, anxious woman whose distress at her tenant's disappearance was immediately apparent. "He stepped out so cheerful last evening, gentlemen," she said, wringing her hands as she admitted us. "Said the hall would be full to bursting, and he'd return with reviews to make the angels weep. Who could have thought such a thing would happen?" Holmes's examination of the sitting room proved exhaustive and revealing. The space spoke of taste constrained by circumstances. 2 decent paintings, a serviceable rug, and a collection of music stands that suggested both professional success and artistic dedication. Upon the mantel stood a silver metronome and a miniature plaster bust of Paganini, while the writing desk bore the accumulated detritus of a busy performer's life. "Observe, Watson," Holmes murmured, lifting a small bottle marked "Carbolic, Dilute" from beside the washstand. Our familiar acquaintance once again. And here, the basin shows faint brownish stains consistent with iodine application. A recent cut, dressed in haste. His attention shifted to a corner where two violin cases stood, one bearing the familiar coffin shape of a professional instrument, the other a plain leather case of obviously cheaper manufacture. When opened, this second case revealed only tissue paper and several pounds of fresh sawdust, a discovery that caused Holmes's eyebrows to rise with interest. "Sawdust to prevent movement during transport," he observed, "typically used by dealers when handling inferior copies or conducting evaluations." Among the scattered correspondence on Hollis's desk, Holmes selected 3 letters of particular significance. The first, written on expensive cream paper, bore Vernon Rook's elegant hand and contained a formal ultimatum regarding the purchase of the Seraph. Terms to be accepted by Friday or permanently withdrawn. The second, scrawled on cheap blue paper, urged Hollis to bring the instrument Thursday evening, the usual place. Signed only with the initials MS. The third proved to be correspondence from the Liar's Voice, offering an interview opportunity from one Augustus Cavendish. Holmes examined the plain leather case once more with his magnifying glass, paying particular attention to the interior seams. "Note the minute crystalline residue. Watson, fish glue crystals, and here a fragment of pale horsehair. Someone rehearsed the severing of a bow before last evening's performance." The implications were staggering. If Hollis had been preparing for his own disappearance, then every piece of evidence we had discovered might have been deliberately planted to misdirect our investigation. But toward what ultimate purpose? Mrs. Larkin's recollections of recent visitors proved equally illuminating. A dark, elegant gentleman with a velvet collar had called on Tuesday afternoon, remaining approximately 10 minutes and speaking with the smoothest speech imaginable. On Thursday at tea time, a thin gentleman with spectacles who smelt strongly of ink had inquired about insurance arrangements for valuable instruments, leaving behind a card bearing Augustus Cavendish's name. As we prepared to depart, I noticed Holmes palm a small, dog-eared rectangle from the desk's clutter. Later, as we descended the stairs, I glimpsed it between his fingers. A pawnbroker's ticket from Marylebone Street, marked "1 violin, evaluation only." We had barely reached the pavement when a red-headed telegraph boy nearly collided with us in his haste. "Mr. Holmes, urgent message from Inspector Lestrade, sir." Holmes tore open the yellow envelope, his expression hardening as he read the contents aloud. "Night watchman, struck down, stop scenery. Room forced, stop large hamper missing, stop return at once. Stop Lestrade." "The performance enters its second act, Watson," Holmes said grimly, signaling for a hansom with urgent gestures. "Our carefully constructed puzzle grows impatient of our leisurely investigation. Whatever game is being played at Vauxhall, the stakes have just been considerably raised." As our cab raced back toward South London through the gathering dusk, I reflected on the mounting complexity of our case. We had discovered evidence of careful preparation, mysterious visitors, financial pressures, and now violence. Yet Holmes's growing conviction that we were being deliberately led through an elaborate deception suggested that even these latest developments might be part of some larger, more sinister design. The Vanishing Violinist of Vauxhall was proving to be not merely a puzzle of impossible disappearance, but a masterpiece of misdirection that challenged every assumption about the nature of truth itself. Our return to the Vauxhall Pavilion revealed a scene of calculated chaos that immediately confirmed Holmes's growing suspicions about the theatrical nature of our case. The night watchman, one Albert Griggs, sat propped against the stage door with his head bandaged, while Lestrade paced the service yard with the agitated manner of a man whose orderly investigation had been violently disrupted. "Struck down round midnight," Lestrade reported tersely as we approached. Found unconscious near the scenery storage, keys missing from his belt. The door to the storage room had been forced, and that confounded hamper with the blue ribbon gone without a trace. Holmes knelt beside the injured man, his examination both gentle and thorough. "Mr. Griggs, can you recall anything of your attacker? Any detail, however slight?" The watchman's weathered features creased with effort. "Heard sounds in the storage room, sir. Thought it might be stagehands working late, but when I went to investigate..." He touched his bandaged head gingerly. "Tall fellow, well-dressed, moved like a gentleman but struck like a professional. Caught a glimpse of spectacles in my lantern light before everything went dark." The description matched Augustus Cavendish precisely, yet Holmes's expression suggested he found this convenient identification as suspect as the other evidence we had accumulated. His examination of the storage room door proved particularly illuminating, while the splintered wood appeared to show violent forcing. His magnifying glass revealed telltale signs of preparation. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, running his finger along the break. "The wood fibers show scoring from within. This door was weakened in advance, then forced outward to create the appearance of violent entry. Note also these minute traces of fish glue and fresh sawdust, identical to what we discovered in Hollis's lodgings." Inside the storage room, the space where the hamper had stood showed clear drag marks leading to the service entrance. But Holmes's attention focused on a crumpled paper near the wall, a removal authorization bearing Mortlake's forged signature, the ink still tacky to the touch. "Ruling ink again," Holmes observed, dabbing the document with his handkerchief. "Our mysterious conductor's preferred medium makes another appearance. Yet this forgery was executed in haste. Note how the pressure varies, suggesting the writer was working under considerable stress." At the service gate, fresh wheel ruts in the soft earth indicated a cart had waited in the alley. Holmes examined these impressions with characteristic thoroughness, measuring their depth and spacing with his pocket rule. "A furniture van or similar heavy conveyance," he concluded. "The impressions suggest a load of considerable weight, far more than a single violin case would require. Whatever was transported in that hamper was either extraordinarily heavy or accompanied by additional cargo." As we prepared to leave, Holmes drew me aside, his grey eyes reflecting that peculiar intensity I had learned to associate with his moments of greatest insight. "Watson," he said quietly, "we have been dancing to someone else's tune from the very beginning. Every clue, every revelation, every convenient suspect has been orchestrated with theatrical precision. The attack on Griggs, this staged theft, these are not complications of our investigation, but carefully planned acts in an elaborate performance." He withdrew the pawnbroker's ticket from his pocket, studying it with renewed interest. "Yet our mysterious playwright has made one crucial error. He has mistaken us for mere audience when we are, in fact, fellow players. The time has come to abandon our reactive investigation and begin writing our own script." The implications were staggering. If Holmes was correct, then everything we had discovered, the secret panel, the convenient hamper, the suspicious timing, had been deliberately arranged to lead us toward predetermined conclusions. But toward what ultimate purpose remained the central mystery. "Come," Holmes said, his voice carrying a note of grim determination I had rarely heard before. "We have an appointment in Marylebone Street, and after that I believe it is time we attended the usual place mentioned in Hollis's correspondence. Tonight, Watson, we cease being the audience and become the critics who expose the illusion." As our hansom carried us through the gas-lit streets toward whatever revelation awaited, I reflected that our vanishing violinist had indeed orchestrated a masterpiece, but like all great performances, its success would ultimately depend upon the sophistication of its audience. And in Sherlock Holmes, he had chosen to perform before the most discerning critic in all of London. The pawnbroker's establishment in Marylebone Street proved to be a respectable concern, its brass nameplate bearing the legend S. Weiss and Sons, established 1847. The proprietor himself, a dignified gentleman with the keen eyes of his profession, received us in his private office with the discretion that marked establishments catering to temporary embarrassments among the better classes. Mr. Hollis, certainly, he confirmed upon examining the ticket Holmes presented. Though I must say, gentlemen, his transaction was most unusual. He brought the instrument Wednesday morning, not for pledge, mind you, but for authentication and valuation. Holmes leaned forward with that peculiar intensity I'd learned to recognize. Authentication, you say? Indeed. Most particular about it he was. Wished to confirm beyond doubt that his Stradivarius was genuine, the varnish, the tool marks, every detail of provenance. My expert pronounced it authentic Cremona work of 1713, worth every guinea of 3,000. Weiss paused, his expression troubled. But there was something in his manner, relief, I would say, when we confirmed its authenticity, as though he had expected to discover otherwise. The implications struck me immediately, but Holmes merely nodded as though this revelation fitted perfectly into some larger pattern. Did he mention his intentions for the instrument? Only that circumstances might force a sale. He spoke of pressing obligations and a collector, Mr. Rook, I believe, who had made an attractive offer. But he seemed torn between financial necessity and artistic attachment. As we departed, Holmes consulted his pocket watch with the air of a man whose calculations had been precisely confirmed. The plot reveals its true nature, Watson. Our vanishing violinist did not lose his instrument. He authenticated it before staging his own disappearance. The question that remains is whether he orchestrated this elaborate performance alone, or whether he has become an unwilling player in someone else's composition. The address Holmes had deduced from the cryptic MS notation in Hollis's correspondence led us through the gathering dusk to Charlotte Street, where a modest music establishment bore the sign M. Steinway, Instruments and Repairs. Above the shop, warm gaslight glowed behind drawn curtains, and the shadows of animated conversation played across the fabric. Holmes positioned us in the shelter of a doorway opposite, his attention focused on both the front entrance and the narrow service alley that connected to the rear of the building. Observe, Watson, how conveniently arranged for discreet commerce. Whatever business transpires above has been planned with careful attention to arrival and departure. Our vigil proved both brief and illuminating. At precisely 8 o'clock, Otto Voss emerged from the alley, his usually immaculate appearance showing signs of considerable strain. His hands bore fresh stains of ruling ink, and he carried a leather satchel with the furtive manner of a man completing clandestine business. He paused beneath a gas lamp to consult his pocket watch, and I observed that his fingertips showed the telltale abrasions Holmes had noted earlier. Our theatrical conductor keeps more than musical appointments, Holmes murmured as Vass disappeared into the evening crowd. Minutes later, Augustus Cavendish appeared, though his scholarly demeanor had given way to something more purposeful. He carried what appeared to be a reduced version of the hamper we had seen at Vauxhall, its bulk considerably diminished from our earlier observations. After both men had departed, Holmes approached the building with characteristic boldness. The proprietor, Marcus Steinway, proved to be a nervous, scholarly gentleman whose explanation struck me as rehearsed rather than spontaneous. Merely a consultation regarding rare musical manuscripts, he insisted, though his hands trembled perceptibly. Mr. Vass requires copies of certain orchestral parts, and Mr. Cavendish represents a private collector interested in acquiring historical documents. Holmes's examination of the upper room revealed the detritus of recent conference, chairs arranged for intimate discussion, the lingering scent of carbolic soap, and most tellingly, fragments of horsehair scattered near the fireplace. Upon the mantel stood an empty violin case, its red velvet lining bearing the perfect impression of a missing instrument. The Seraph's temporary sanctuary, Holmes observed, running his finger along the dusty velvet. But observe, Watson, this case shows no signs of recent occupation. The dust patterns suggest weeks of abandonment, yet the impression remains perfect. His attention was caught by an instrument in the shop's main display case, a violin of exceptional workmanship that seemed to gleam within a fire despite the dim gaslight. "Mr. Steinway," Holmes called. "This violin, when did you acquire it?" The proprietor's face paled visibly. "This morning, sir. A private sale from a gentleman in considerable distress. Paid in cash, he did, and seemed most eager to complete the transaction." Holmes studied the instrument through the glass, his grey eyes reflecting that peculiar light I had learned to associate with moments of profound revelation. "Italian work, I would venture." "Indeed, sir, though perhaps not quite of the first rank. A masterful copy, one might say, of a more celebrated original." As we emerged into the gaslit street, Holmes's expression carried that grim satisfaction which marked the resolution of a complex puzzle. "Watson," he said quietly, "we have been investigating a crime that never occurred while ignoring the masterpiece of deception that has unfolded before our very eyes. Our vanishing violinist has not been the victim of an impossible crime, sir. He has been the architect of an impossible solution." The revelation transformed everything we had discovered. The authentication at the pawnbroker's, the careful timing of the disappearance, the theatrical evidence at Vauxhall, all had been orchestrated to create the illusion of theft while masking an elaborate substitution. But whether Ambrose Hollis was the master of this deception or merely its most accomplished performer remained the central mystery that would determine whether we faced a case of artistic fraud or something far more sinister. "Come," Holmes said, his voice carrying a note of grim anticipation. "The evening's performance has only begun, and I believe it is time we claimed our seats for the final act." Our return to Baker Street found Holmes in that state of controlled intensity which invariably preceded his most decisive actions. The sitting room, with its familiar chaos of chemical apparatus and scattered papers, provided the perfect laboratory for his final analysis of the evidence we had accumulated throughout this bewildering day. "Watson," he said, moving immediately to his workbench, "we have been presented with a masterpiece of misdirection, a crime that solves itself while concealing its true nature entirely. Observe." He arranged the various samples we had collected with methodical precision, the lamp black from the window-sill, fragments of the blue silk thread, the wood shaving from the corridor, and the crystalline residue from Hollis's violin case. His chemical analysis proved both swift and illuminating. The lamp black, when subjected to his reagents, revealed traces of theatrical grease paint mixed with genuine soot. "Applied not for concealment, Watson, but for dramatic effect, to ensure that any investigating detective would discover exactly what our mysterious playwright intended him to find." The ruling ink from Vass's fingers showed additives consistent with rapid drying, while the fish glue crystals contained minute traces of Rossini, confirming their association with violin repair work. Most significantly, the wood shaving proved to be pine rather than the oak of the pavilion's construction, evidence of recent carpentry work performed elsewhere and transported to the scene. "Consider the sequence of events," Holmes continued, his grey eyes bright with a thrill of intellectual victory. "Wednesday morning, Hollis authenticates his Stradivarius at Weiss's establishment, not from doubt about its provenance, but to establish its documented value before its disappearance. That same afternoon he meets with Vernon Rook, ostensibly about a sale, but actually to create witnesses to his financial desperation." Holmes moved to his desk, where he withdrew several telegrams that had arrived during our absence. "Our colleagues in Edinburgh confirmed that a Mr. Ambrose Hollis has indeed arrived for rehearsals at the Assembly Rooms. Yet we know from our visit to Steinway's that the Seraph remains in London, having been replaced by what the proprietor carefully described as a masterful copy of a more celebrated original." The implication struck me with stunning clarity. Then Hollis never vanished at all. He merely created the illusion of impossible disappearance while effecting an elaborate substitution. "Precisely, Watson. The locked room mystery was pure theatrical misdirection, drawing our attention to the impossibility of escape while the true crime, the substitution of instruments, occurred through the very mechanism we discovered. The secret panel was not Hollis's means of exit, but his method of exchanging the genuine Stradivarius for an accomplished forgery. Holmes began pacing with that restless energy which marked his moments of greatest insight. Otto Vass, with his technical knowledge and access to the pavilion, prepared the mechanism and forged the necessary documents. Augustus Cavendish, our mysterious journalist and collector, served as intermediary for the actual sale of the genuine instrument. Even the attack on poor Griggs was choreographed to remove the hamper containing the authentic seraph before our investigation could discover its true contents. He paused before the fireplace, his sharp profile etched against the flames. But our composer has made one crucial error, Watson. He has assumed that by creating a perfect mechanical solution to an impossible crime, he could deflect suspicion from the far simpler deception that underlies it all. Tonight, we shall attend the final performance of this elaborate symphony. Holmes moved to his collection of disguises with purposeful efficiency, selecting items with the care of a man preparing for decisive confrontation. I have sent word to our various players, requesting their presence at a special gathering. Mr. Rook, eager to inspect a recovered Stradivarius. Mr. Cavendish, summoned to authenticate certain documents. And Mr. Vass, invited to discuss irregularities in the pavilion's accounts. Where shall this gathering take place? Where all the best theatrical performances conclude, Watson, upon the very stage where our drama began. The Vauxhall Pavilion awaits our return, and with it, the resolution of the most ingenious deception it has been my privilege to unravel. As Holmes completed his preparations, checking the mechanism of his revolver and consulting his pocket watch with military precision, I reflected upon the extraordinary complexity of the case we had investigated. What had appeared to be an impossible crime had revealed itself as an elaborate insurance fraud. Yet the artistry of its execution commanded a grudging admiration. "Come, Watson," Holmes said finally, his voice carrying that note of grim anticipation I had learned to associate with his moments of greatest triumph. The curtain rises on our final act. Tonight we discover whether our vanishing violinist has composed a masterpiece of deception or merely provided the prelude to his own downfall. The fog had lifted from London's streets, and the gas lamps burned with unusual clarity as we descended into the night. Behind us lay the comfortable certainty of Baker Street. Ahead, the gaslit mysteries of Vauxhall and a confrontation that would test not only Holmes's deductive powers, but his ability to expose a deception so carefully crafted that it had transformed crime into art, and art into the most dangerous performance of all. The Vauxhall Pavilion at 10 o'clock that evening presented a vastly different aspect from our morning visit, its gaslit stage transformed into an arena where truth would finally triumph over elaborate deception. Holmes had arranged for our gathering with theatrical precision, positioning a single table center stage where the recovered violin case gleamed under the footlights like the central prop in some grand drama. Lestrade arrived first, his official presence lending gravity to the proceedings, followed by the nervous Mortlake, whose perspiring features suggested he suspected the evening might prove costly to his establishment's reputation. Vernon Rook appeared precisely at the appointed hour, his collector's keen eye immediately drawn to the instrument case, while Otto Vass entered with obvious reluctance, his scholarly composure replaced by the furtive manner of a man whose careful plans were unraveling. Most significantly, Augustus Cavendish materialized from the shadows with that elaborate courtesy which had marked our earlier encounters, though his spectacles now reflected something more calculating than mere scholarly interest. Miss Cora Beaumont completed our assembly, her blue silk dress catching the gaslight as she took her position with the poise of a seasoned performer. "Gentlemen and Miss Beaumont," Holmes began, his voice carrying clearly through the intimate space, "we have gathered to resolve what appeared to be an impossible mystery. The vanishing of a man and his priceless violin from a locked room under careful observation. Yet I submit that no disappearance occurred at all. What we witnessed was the most elaborate performance of misdirection ever attempted in the service of fraud. He moved to Hollis's dressing room, where I observed he had made certain preparations during our brief absence. Along the skirting where the secret panel lay concealed, he had dusted a fine layer of starch powder tinted faintly with blue. Beneath the bolt mechanism, he had positioned a delicate slip of paper that would betray the slightest disturbance. The mechanism we discovered was not designed for escape, Holmes continued, but for the exchange of instruments. While attention focused on the impossibility of the locked room, the genuine Stradivarius was passed through this hidden opening and replaced with an accomplished forgery. He opened the violin case to reveal the instrument within, its varnish gleaming under the stage lights. This, Mr. Rook, is indeed a seraph, but not the seraph. Observe the tool marks, perfectly executed but too precise for genuine period work. This instrument is a masterwork of modern craftsmanship, designed to deceive even the most expert eye. Voss shifted uncomfortably, his ink-stained fingers betraying his nervousness. I don't understand what you're suggesting, Mr. Holmes. Then allow me to illuminate the performance, Mr. Voss. Wednesday morning, Hollis authenticated his genuine Stradivarius at Weiss's establishment. Not from doubt, but to establish documented value before its theft. Your expertise in musical notation extended to violin construction, and your access to the pavilion's hidden spaces made you the perfect accomplice for preparing the secret mechanism. Holmes withdrew the wood shaving from his pocket. Pine shavings from your carpentry work, Mr. Voss. The panel was constructed with meticulous care, its operation smoothed with French chalk and designed to transfer the genuine instrument while leaving behind this masterful forgery. At that moment, a slight sound from the corridor caught Holmes's attention, the faintest scrape of movement near the dressing room. His grey eyes flashed with satisfaction. Inspector Lestrade, if you would be so kind as to examine our preparations. We moved as one toward the dressing room, where the blue powder along the skirting now bore the clear impression of searching fingers, and the paper, beneath the bolt, showed a clean tear where it had been disturbed. But most telling of all, a figure emerged from the shadows of the corridor. Augustus Cavendish, his hands now vividly marked with blue starch, his spectacles askew. Caught investigating the very mechanism you helped design, Mr. Cavendish? Holmes observed with grim satisfaction. The powder has recorded your touch as clearly as any signature. Cavendish's scholarly composure cracked entirely. You understand nothing, Holmes. The plan was perfect. Indeed it was, Holmes replied. A masterpiece of coordinated deception. Mr. Cavendish, you provided the scholarly credentials to authenticate the forgery and arrange its placement. Mr. Voss constructed the mechanism and forged the necessary documents with his ruling ink. Even the attack on poor Griggs was choreographed to remove the hamper containing the authentic seraph before our investigation could discover its contents. He turned to address the assembled company with the authority of a conductor bringing a complex symphony to its climax. Ambrose Hollis orchestrated his own disappearance to commit insurance fraud on an unprecedented scale. The severed bow, the lamp-black, the blue silk thread, all carefully planted evidence designed to suggest an impossible crime while concealing a remarkably simple substitution. Miss Beaumont stepped forward, her composure finally breaking. I knew nothing of this deception, Mr. Holmes. My dress, my trunk, they were used without my knowledge to create false trails. I believe you, Miss Beaumont. Your role was that of the unwitting accomplice, your presence and possessions cleverly woven into the fabric of deception to provide convenient misdirection should the need arise. Rook's face had grown ashen as the implications became clear. Then the instrument I was offered was genuine, Mr. Rook, but already stolen. Your role was to provide credible motive for Hollis's apparent desperation while serving as the ultimate purchaser of the authentic Stradivarius. A perfect crime that would have netted our vanishing violinist both insurance compensation and private sale proceeds. Lestrade stepped forward with official authority. "Augustus Cavendish, Otto Vass, I arrest you on charges of conspiracy to defraud and assault upon a peace officer." As the constables moved to secure the prisoners, Holmes delivered his final observation with that peculiar satisfaction which marked his greatest triumphs. "The greatest performances, gentlemen, are those which make the audience believe they are witnessing one story while an entirely different drama unfolds before their very eyes. Our Vanishing Violinist composed a masterpiece of deception, but like all great works, it required the most discerning critic to appreciate its true artistry." The fog had lifted entirely from London streets as we departed the pavilion, leaving the gas lamps to burn, with unusual clarity in the crisp February air. Behind us lay the resolution of one of the most ingenious frauds ever attempted. Ahead, the comfortable certainty of Baker Street and the satisfaction of justice served through the application of pure reasoning to the most elaborate theatrical deception. "A remarkable case, Holmes," I observed, as our hansom carried us through the gaslit streets. "The audacity of staging one's own impossible disappearance to mask insurance fraud." "Indeed, Watson. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect was not the complexity of the deception, but the psychology that conceived it. Our vanishing violinist understood that the human mind, when presented with an impossibility, will focus so intently upon solving that impossibility that it overlooks the simple truth hidden in plain sight. Tonight, we have restored both the seraph to its rightful place and the proper relationship between performer and audience, with ourselves firmly established as the critics who expose rather than validate the illusion." The gaslight of the Vauxhall Pavilion's stage created an almost ethereal atmosphere as Lestrade stepped forward to secure our prisoners. Cavendish, his scholarly composure finally shattered, offered no resistance as the handcuffs clicked into place, while Vass stood with the resigned air of a man whose carefully constructed world had collapsed around him. "Before we depart," Holmes announced, his voice carrying clearly through the intimate space, "perhaps our audience would benefit from understanding the complete mechanics of this remarkable performance." He moved to the dressing-room, withdrawing his pocket watch with theatrical precision. The key to the entire deception lay not in the impossible locked room, but in the precise choreography that made the substitution possible. "Watson, you noted the metronome upon Hollis's mantel. Such devices serve not merely to maintain musical tempo, but can be calibrated to coordinate any sequence of timed activities." Holmes began pacing with that restless energy which marked his moments of greatest insight. "At 9:35, Miss Beaumont arrives, providing the blue silk evidence that would later misdirect our investigation. At 9:40 precisely, Pike leaves Hollis alone, not to prepare for his second-half performance, but to complete the final phase of an elaborate substitution. The genuine Stradivarius passes through the secret panel to Vass, who waits in the adjoining room with a masterful forgery prepared by Cavendish's network of skilled craftsmen. The implication struck me with stunning clarity as Holmes continued his reconstruction. At 9:45, Vass begins his carefully timed errand to the telegraph office, carrying the authentic seraph concealed within his music satchel. At 9:50, the call boy knocks and hears that telltale scraping sound. Not furniture being moved, but the secret panel being operated for the final time as Hollis secures the forgery in its case. Our meditation upon this mechanical precision was interrupted by the arrival of 3 telegraph boys in rapid succession. Lestrade tore open the first message, his narrow features brightening as he read aloud. From Edinburgh, Hollis taken quietly at assembly rooms during evening rehearsal. Found with forged insurance documents and correspondence from London accomplices. Maintains innocence, but evidence overwhelming. The second telegram proved equally illuminating. From Euston Goods Yard, large crate consigned A. Hollis intercepted. Contents include genuine Stradivarius wrapped in concert programs. Shipping documents bear Cavendish signature. Holmes accepted these confirmations with the satisfaction of a conductor whose symphony had reached its intended crescendo. The final movement of our Vanishing Violinist's composition, gentlemen. While maintaining his alibi in Scotland, Hollis intended to collect both insurance compensation for the stolen instrument and private sale proceeds from its clandestine disposal to collectors like Mr. Rook. In Lestrade's makeshift interrogation room beneath the stage, the full scope of the conspiracy gradually emerged. Vas, his scholarly demeanor crumbling under the weight of evidence, spoke with the careful precision of a man seeking absolution through confession. "We sought only to preserve great art from the vulgar demands of commerce," he insisted, his ink-stained fingers trembling as he signed his statement. Hollis was desperate, creditors pressing, his Edinburgh engagement threatened. Cavendish convinced us that substitution was merely another form of conservation, that the forgery would serve the public while protecting the original from the hazards of performance. Cavendish himself proved less forthcoming, maintaining his scholarly dignity, even as the evidence mounted against him. "I authenticated nothing beyond what any expert might observe," he declared, though the blue powder upon his hands and the forged documents in his distinctive ruling ink spoke more eloquently than his protestations. It was past midnight when we finally departed the pavilion, the genuine seraph secured in Lestrade's custody, and our prisoners bound for the cells of Scotland Yard. The fog had lifted entirely from London's streets, and the gas lamps burned with unusual clarity, as our hansom carried us through the familiar thoroughfares toward Baker Street. "A remarkable case, Holmes," I observed, settling back against the worn upholstery. "The audacity of staging one's own impossible disappearance while maintaining an alibi in another city. It required not merely criminal ingenuity, but genuine theatrical genius." Holmes withdrew his pipe, the familiar ritual marking the transition from active investigation to contemplative analysis. "Indeed, Watson. Yet perhaps the most instructive aspect was not the complexity of the deception, but the psychology that conceived it. Hollis understood that the human mind, when presented with a spectacular impossibility, will expend all its energy attempting to reconcile that impossibility while overlooking the simpler truth that lies beneath. The sitting room at 221B welcomed us with its familiar chaos of chemical apparatus and scattered papers, Mrs. Hudson having thoughtfully left the gas burning low and a pot of tea warming by the fire. Holmes moved immediately to his violin, his long fingers testing the strings with the practiced touch of a true musician. "There is a legitimate deception in art, Watson," he observed, drawing his bow across the strings in a series of complex arpeggios that seemed to echo the intricate logic he had just displayed. "The painter's trick of light, the conjurer's acknowledged sleight of hand. But there is also an illegitimate deception, to call theft a rescue and fraud a philosophy. Our vanishing violinist sought to transform crime into art, but in the end, logic proved more powerful than any theatrical illusion." The soft notes of a Bach air filled the room as Holmes began to play, his interpretation carrying that melancholy beauty which always marked his reflective moods. Through our window, London's gaslit streets stretched away into the winter night, their familiar patterns restored to proper order by the application of systematic reasoning to the most bewildering of mysteries. As the clock upon our mantel chimed one, Holmes set aside his violin and reached for the morning's correspondence, where I observed a familiar yellow envelope bearing the urgent markings of Scotland Yard. "Tomorrow's case arrives tonight, Watson," he said with that peculiar smile which marked the transition from one mystery to the next. "A gentleman whose walking stick bears the marks of a left-handed man, yet whose signature shows the characteristic flourishes of right-handed penmanship. Most intriguing." And so, with the seraph restored to its rightful place and the players in that elaborate drama brought each to their proper end, we returned to our domestic theatre in Baker Street, where the slender, keen figure at the window stood ready to direct the next performance in the endless repertory of human folly and ingenuity. The Vanishing Violinist of Vauxhall had played his final movement, and the critics had rendered their decisive verdict, not through applause, but through the inexorable logic that transforms mystery into understanding and deception into truth. In the end, perhaps that was the greatest lesson of all, that in a world of endless theatrical possibilities, the most profound magic lies not in creating illusions, but in the patient work of dispelling them, one careful observation at a time.